2016, Mr. Messenger was awarded the Missouri Honor Medal, which is the highest award bestowed by University of Missouri School of Journalism. That same year, he won the National Headliner Award for editorial writing. In 2015, Mr. Messenger was a Pulitzer finalist for his series of editorials on the events pertaining to race and policing in Ferguson, Missouri. And he won the Sigma Delta Chi Award for the best editorials of the year that year, which was given by the Society of Professional Journalists. He lives here in Missouri, in Wildwood, Missouri, with his wife and 2 children. He has 4 grown children, and 8 grandchildren. Profits and Punishment, which we will have for sale and a book signing after this event, is his first book. So please give a warm welcome to Mr. Messenger.
Thank you all for being here. Even if it takes extra credit, I'll take what I can get. I tell you what. So I'm glad I contributed to some of you getting better grades today. I'm going to have to upgrade my bio. It's actually 9 grandchildren now.
Okay.
I tell you what, they just keep coming. So the first time I came to St. Charles County to give a talk on this topic, I was a little bit nervous about my crowd. And the reason I was nervous about my crowd is I was writing about the topic of debtors' prisons, which ultimately ended up being the columns that won me the Pulitzer and ended up being the backbone to this, to my book, Profit and Punishment. And I was invited to speak to a group of folks with a political action organization called Americans for Prosperity. Now, some of you know who Americans for Prosperity is. They're a group on the right side of the political spectrum, started by the Koch brothers originally. They tend to be libertarian, at least in philosophy. Most of their members happen to be, at least the ones that I met that day, sort of Trumpian Republicans. I work for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Some of you know that folks on that side of the spectrum tend to call the Post-Dispatch the Post-Disgrace and call me things like woke and liberal and progressive and communist and socialist and whatever. So it wasn't exactly like walking into a crowd of fervent supporters, and I was a little nervous about it. I walked in and stuck my head into the room, and sure enough, the room was full of people wearing MAGA hats at the time. This was back in 2019. But they were interested in what I had to say that day, because debtors' prison doesn't really know left or right. As you might know, we banned debtors' prisons, at least theoretically, in the 1800s in this country. And yet I had started writing about, in 2017 and 2018, people in Missouri who were literally sent to debtors' prisons. Now, the judges wouldn't say that, but that's what was happening. People were charged with misdemeanor crimes, and they did their time. Many of them pleaded guilty and got sentences that were suspended. Some of them actually did 30 days in jail or some period of time. And then they got out of jail and they got a bill for their time in jail. What you may not know, what I didn't know until late 2017, is that every state in the country, except for New Hampshire, which recently repealed theirs, every state in the country has a law that allows cities, counties, and state prisons to charge for time in jail. And many people get those bills. Most poor people can't afford to pay these bills. And I started to come across these cases of people who committed minor misdemeanor crimes, did some time in jail, got a bill, and then the judge was requiring them to come back month after month after month and either pay them some money towards their bill, or they would face the possibility of going back to jail again. What I found with my Americans for Prosperity audience that day was they got it. They understood that this was a violation of civil rights. They understood that this was taxation by citation. They understood that you don't have to be on the left or right or anywhere in the middle to understand that putting poor people in jail primarily because they're poor is against the US Constitution and is just an amoral thing to do. Unfortunately, it was happening a lot in Missouri in 2019 until the Missouri Supreme Court put at least somewhat of an end to the practice. So how did we get here? How did we get to a place in a country that banned debtors' prisons in the last century to a place where poor people are still going to jail after committing minor crimes, primarily because they can't afford to pay their bills for their time in jail and other fines and fees. One of the best ways I know to help people understand the situation in our criminal justice system, or as some people like to call it these days, the criminal legal system, because it lacks a lot of justice, is to talk about Brooke Bergen. Brooke Bergen is somebody that I first wrote about in 2018. She stole an $8 tube of mascara from a Walmart in Salem, Missouri, which is in Dent County, south central part of the state. And she ended up serving a year in jail for that shoplifting charge, a misdemeanor. And then when she got out of jail after not committing another crime, she owed $15,000. And when I ended up writing about Brooke, she had already been out of jail. She had already done her year of time in jail, but the judge was still requiring her to show up in the Dent County courthouse every month and either offer some pittance to pay that she could afford towards that $15,000 or face going back to jail again. And at the time I first wrote about Brooke Bergen, I made a mistake. When I talk to journalism audiences, I always tell them, I was like, you know, a lot of young journalists have this vision someday of, hey, maybe I might win a Pulitzer and then I'll be famous and I get to go around, give speeches and talk about all of this magic stuff I did in my journalism. And it turns out that I did win the Pulitzer, but my Pulitzer was created on a mistake that I made. Because that mistake really led to me changing my focus in terms of what I was writing about. I'll tell you about the mistake here in a little bit. I came across Brooke's case and I had asked lawyers in the state to send me all different sorts of cases like this, where people were being faced with going back to jail because they owed money on these minor misdemeanor offenses and they couldn't afford to pay it. And Brooks was the one who really stood out. And when I looked at Brooks' case, part of my mistake was I thought I had a math story, because I thought it would be really easy to just do the math and have people understand the injustice of what was happening to her. $8 tube of mascara that she stole ended up owing $15,000. It doesn't make sense. There are some people, depending on where you are in the political spectrum, who would debate what the proper sentence is for stealing an $8 tube of mascara, particularly with some of the details in Brooke's life where she had committed other crimes previously. I tend to think a year for shoplifting an $8 tube of mascara is a little harsh, but other people might say, well, you know, do the crime, you know, you got to be able to do the time. But I haven't found anybody yet who thinks that somebody who stole an $8 tube of mascara should end up owing the criminal justice system $15,000 for that crime and face further prison time. So I wrote about Brooke's case and a couple of other people in her community, Leanne Vanderman and Amy Murr and other folks, many of them single mothers who faced the same situation and ended up in jail and losing their minimum wage jobs and time away from their kids and everything else. And I did get a lot of reaction to it. People understood the math of $8 and $15,000. But there was one reaction in particular that was interesting the next morning after that column ran. I got a Facebook message from Brooke Bergen. This is where we get to my mistake. Young journalists today, with basically anybody younger than me, understand that just because you can't find, you know, the old phone numbers that I called for Brooke in the court records that didn't work anymore, and I couldn't track her down and I couldn't find her, and I talked to her lawyer and he didn't know where she was living anymore. I still wrote about the case because I had all the court records. That's not how you find people these days. You find people on Facebook, and you find people on Twitter, and you find people on Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok and probably the 7 different social media things that the young people in this room are already on that the rest of us my age and older, we don't know what they are yet. And frankly, we probably don't want to know. But that's how you find people today. And I didn't take that extra step to search for Brooke Bergen on Facebook because I thought I was writing a math story. And the next day, Brooke Bergen took that step and she found me. She was a little upset that her name was in the paper without her knowing, with full details of this case and everything, but she was really glad that somebody cared. She said, there's lots of us in Salem. There are more of us in Dent County, and there are more of us all over the state. And we all meet each other in these county jails, and we tell our stories, and we are shocked and amazed that the prosecutors and public defenders and judges and sheriffs don't seem to care that they're basically just putting a bunch of poor people in jail because they can't afford to pay their bills. And so she invited me to Dent County. She's like, you've got to meet us. You've got to meet these people. And I realized what I was missing, that this wasn't a math story. This was a human story. This was a story about our sisters and our brothers and our aunts and our uncles and our grandfathers and our grandchildren who have experiences like this, minor interactions with the police, sometimes through traffic, sometimes through shoplifting, sometimes through teenagers doing stupid things that teenagers sometimes do. And those minor interactions becoming something that became an albatross around a person's neck for a year or decades or longer, simply because they owed the courts money. One of the people that I met when I went to Caldwell County, it's a county up in Northwest Missouri, is a gentleman named Corey Booth. And Corey's story resonates with me now even more than it did when I wrote about him, because I have a 17-year-old. Corey was 17 when he did a teenage thing. He stole a lawnmower. Him and his buddies were out walking in rural Caldwell County, and there was this lawnmower sitting out on this woman's yard that wasn't mowed, and they decided, nobody's going to know that that's gone. Let's go steal the lawnmower, and maybe we can do something with the engine or whatever. So they steal the lawnmower. Corey takes it home. The woman calls the police. The police go to the local teenage troublemakers and say, hey, anybody know what happened? Somebody fingers Corey. They show up at Corey's house and he's like, yeah, I stole a lawnmower. It doesn't work. I already put it back. They arrested him for theft, misdemeanor charge of theft, took him to jail. He spent the night in jail next to a guy charged with felony bank robbery. That scared him. Got his charges, ended up in jail for a few days because he couldn't afford to pay the bail. Got out eventually once a public defender was able to get the bail lowered. Eventually pleads guilty to the misdemeanor charge after serving about 30 days in jail off and on. And thinks that he's done, thinks that he's free and clear. But then he gets a bill for the 30 days that he spent in jail. And he's also put on probation, in which he's supervised by a private for-profit probation company. Every rural county in Missouri has these companies because the state of Missouri, more than a decade ago, decided to stop funding probation services for people charged with misdemeanors. So now there's private for-profit companies that do it. You have to pay them for the right to be supervised. And if you miss a payment, that is a violation of your probation. They will drug test you and you have to pay for that drug testing. And if you fail your drug test, you pee dirty, that is a violation of your probation, and that company can help put you back in jail. Corey Booth was a 17-year-old kid who did a stupid thing and smokes pot. And guess what? He ended up being dirty, and they put him back in jail. He wasn't charged with a drug offense, but he went back to jail for a few days. And guess what? When he got out, he got another bill. Owed more money for his time in jail. I met Corey 10 years later. He was 27 years old. He had not committed another crime. He had not been charged with a single crime in that 10 years. He owed, in 2018, $7,000 to Caldwell County because he could never afford to pay and get caught up from it. And the judge was requiring him to go to court once a month. When you're a poor person and you have to go to one of these county court days, you should go to one someday if you've never been to one and just sit there and watch what happens. 30 or 40 or 50 people, depending on the jurisdiction, have to go there and give up half a day of their minimum wage job, if they're lucky enough to have one, in order to sit there and wait for their time in turn to stand up and tell the judge, sorry, I don't have any money today. In part because you made me sit here all day away from my job that you just took me from. I think about Corey Booth because hopefully my 17-year-old doesn't watch this, but my 17-year-old has done some of the things that 17-year-olds do when they occasionally are just stretching their legs in the real world. But he didn't end up in jail because his dad could just write a check to make sure that he didn't end up in jail. That's the reality of the world in our criminal legal system. There is a system for people like Brooke Bergen and Colton, and they get punished for almost their entire lives because of it. And there's a system for people, middle-class white people, who can afford to write a check. One of the other people that I met when I was starting to work on these columns in 28 was a gentleman named William Everts. And his story is really interesting because he explains how this is not just a rural problem where we have to worry about what happens in a county. Here in St. Charles, it's part of the overall St. Louis metropolitan area. We deal with homelessness. Some of it actually here in St. Charles County, most of it in closer to downtown St. Louis and in certain parts of St. Louis County. But homelessness is a problem that our major cities in Missouri have to deal with. William Everts is homeless, or at least he was the last time I was talking to him. In Caldwell County, when he was a younger man, he stole a computer from a church. The church had a food pantry, and William was poor, and he was standing in line one day to get food from the food pantry. And as he's getting his food, he saw that there was this office adjacent to the church where the food pantry was that had a brand new computer sitting in there. And it had a door that opened to the outside. And William thought, I could steal that computer and get some money. So after he got his food from the food pantry, he went home, came back at night, opened the door, got in, stole the computer. Church notices the computer's gone, call the police. The police are thinking maybe it was somebody who was here at the food pantry. They give him a list of the folks in the food pantry. They end up at William Everts' house. And he says to the police, I am such an idiot. Who steals a computer from a church? Admits it, tells them where it is, points to his trunk. They go, they get the computer, they take it back. They charge him with misdemeanor theft and take him to jail. Same story as Corey Booth. He's in and out of jail a little bit, misses a payment, misses a court date, ends up spending a few more days and a few more days, eventually pleads guilty to time served, and then gets his bill for jail. Can't afford to pay it. He ends up going to Kansas City to try to get his life turned around, and he ends up on the streets in Kansas City as a homeless person. And a local organization of folks who serve the homeless come across him and realize, wow, he's really got an opportunity if we get him cleaned up, get him some job training. He's got some skills. He's not so far gone with addiction or mental health issues, and they're working with him to try to help get him a job and help get him cleaned up and get him off the street. During the process of working with him, they realize he's got this old court case from this stolen computer, this misdemeanor case from Caldwell County, in which he owes a few $1,000s. And it's really contributing to his homelessness. Because what happens a lot of times when you're homeless is you're looking for a place to sleep and you decide, oh, look, there's that steam grate over there where it's a little cold and the steam comes up and I can be warm, and I get my tarp in my bag and I sleep over there. And then the owner of that building calls the police and says, no, you can't be here, and you get a ticket for trespassing. But when they give you your ticket for trespassing, they run your name, and sure enough, William Everts has a warrant out for his arrest in Caldwell County. He always has a warrant out for his arrest in Caldwell County because they take him back to Caldwell County from Kansas City, put him back in the county jail for a few days, and then let him out and give him another bill where he owes more money. They know he's homeless. They know he's not going to be able to pay. They just keep sending him back to Kansas City, and he's Kansas City's problem. So the homeless advocates wrote a letter to the judge, Judge Jason Canoy in Caldwell County. And they said, "Dear Judge, we're trying to help Mr. Evans. Here's what we want to do. We want to bring him to your jail. And he's willing to stay in your jail as long as you need him to stay in your jail in order to wipe out his debt. Can we do that? Can we bring him to you? He's willing to stay in that jail as long as you determine is appropriate to pay off the several $1,000s that he owns. And then we'll take him to Kansas City and we're going to try to get him off the streets." Judge said no. Wanted his money. Never mind, he was not ever going to get the money. It's a homeless person. He doesn't have any money. But the judge said no. That's the state of criminal justice in America, in almost every state in the country, because of the rapidly rising fines and fees and bills for when you stay in jail. And the people who suffer are poor people. 80% of the people who come into our courts in municipal and at the county level are poor people. And we know that because statistically they qualify for a public defender. And yet they're the ones who are being charged all of these backdoor taxes. One of the women that I met that Brooke introduced me to, who also lives in Dent County, is a woman named Amy Murr. And I was down there one day writing about her case, and Amy and I were having lunch, and she asked me a question. She said, "Why are you doing this?" She said, "No offense, but nobody reads the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in Dent County. And nobody's cared about us before. Everybody in the county knows what's happening here. We're just those poor people who end up getting, put back in the jail all the time. Why are you doing this?" And I told her a story. When I was younger, I was going through a divorce and had 4 kids at the time. And my son had a indoor soccer game. This was in suburban Denver, Colorado. And we go to the indoor soccer game, and after the soccer game, he says, "Hey, can I go spend the night at my friend Ryan's house?" And I'm like, "Sure, go ahead." My older daughter's watching my other 2 kids at home at my apartment. My son goes, I start to drive home. I'm driving down a road in Arvada, Colorado, and all of a sudden I see those blue and red lights flashing behind. Some of you have had that experience before, and immediately, you just get a little bit nervous. What did I do? What did I do? And I knew I wasn't speeding, and I knew I hadn't run a red light or anything. I didn't know why I was being pulled over. So I wait for the police officer to come up and hand her my driver's license and registration when she gets there. And she's like, "Mr. Messenger, do you know why I'm pulling you over?" I said, "No." And she said, "You have an expired tag." I had forgotten to renew my tags. I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry." And she's like, "Yeah." I said, "You're going to write me a ticket for that?" And she's like, "Yeah, I need to go back and just run your name through the computer." So she goes back to her car. Keep in mind, this was a long time ago. Police computers were not what they are today. It's taking a while. 5 minutes seemed like 3 hours for me as I'm sitting there staring at the red and blue lights, waiting for her to come up. Another police car pulls up behind her. Thought, well, it doesn't take 2 police officers to write a ticket for expired tags, does it? And sure enough, both police officers come up to the car. "Mr. Messenger, we need you to get out of the car, please." I say, "Excuse me?" "Mr. Messenger, we need you to get out of the car." So I get out of the car and they take me over to my trunk, and hands are on the trunk. And first time in my life, I'm getting patted down, and takes the wrist, puts it behind me, takes the other one, puts it behind me. And now I'm being handcuffed. Walks me back to the police car, hand on top of the head, puts me in the back seat. "Mr. Messenger, do you know why we're placing you under arrest?" No, I'm afraid I don't." She says, "There's a warrant out for your arrest." I said, "Well, what did I do?" And she says, "Well, we don't know yet. Our computers are a little bit slow. We're working on it." So we wait a little bit longer. And eventually the computer said that I had a speeding ticket in the town of Morrison, Colorado that I hadn't paid. Morrison is one of those little speed trap towns. We have a lot of them around St. Louis. We have a lot of them in Missouri. Many of you have seen it before, where all of a sudden the speed limit goes from 55 to 35 to 25 in a period about the length of this table here. And then there's a police officer waiting behind the billboard that you can't see who pulls you over. And I had one of those speeding tickets in the town of Morris. And I obviously forgot to register my tags. I forgot to pay my speeding ticket, and that was my situation. So now I've got a warrant out for my arrest. She's like, I'm going to have to take you into the police station and book you. Do you have any cash with you? And I said, well, my wallet's, sitting up on the front seat of my car. I think I might have $80 or so in there. She's asked for my permission to check. She goes, she checks. My wallet had $80. She's like, great. We'll here's your wallet. We'll take you in. I'll fingerprint you and take your picture and book you, and you'll pay your $80 and you'll be out. I'm like, okay, great. So I'm telling Amy Murr this story. I paid my $80. I was nervous about the whole thing, but I got it home that day. If I were poor and white and lived in rural Missouri like Amy Murr, I would have spent the night in jail that night, and I would have lost my car, and I might have lost my kids, and I might have lost my job, and I would have had devastating consequences to my life for a simple, stupid mistake that I made relating to driving, relating to paying the state fees. If I were poor and I were Black and I lived in North St. Louis County, I would have lost my car that day. I would have ended up in jail. I would have ended up owing a lot of money. I might have lost my kids. I might have lost my job. The effect on my life would have been completely different. Like some of you, I might have first learned of this idea of fines and fees and nickel and diming people to death after Ferguson. After the Ferguson uprising. Much of that uprising obviously had to do with police brutality and the shooting of Michael Brown by a white police officer. But a lot of the underlying angst had to do with young Black people in North County who were constantly being harassed by police in St. Anne, in Ferguson, in Florissant, in Cool Valley, in Delwood, all over the county for minor offenses, and then often not being able to pay the bill for driving without a light over your license plate, which was one of the prolific offenses back in those days. And then getting caught with a warrant out for their arrest and being taken from the St. Anne jail to the St. County jail to the St. Louis County jail to all of the different little towns till everybody got their piece. That was part of the story of Ferguson. And what I realized in 2018 was the story in rural Missouri affecting mostly poor white people, and the story in North County affecting mostly poor Black people, other than the racism, was very much the same story. It was about our criminal justice system being used to extract wealth from poor people. It's not just Ferguson. Just this last week, the suburb of Maplewood settled one of these debtor's prison lawsuits that was brought by the nonprofit law firm Arch City Defenders and also Civil Rights Corps out of Washington, D.C. for $3 million. Because they realized that over years, their behavior of using their driving revenue to fund the city was unconstitutional. Some of those lawsuits are still pending. Ferguson, Florissant, St. Anne. And it's not just here in Missouri. Over the last couple of years, a writer in Alabama named John Archibald, who won the Pulitzer in commentary the year before I did, has been writing a series of stories about Brookside, Alabama, a town that basically created its police force to raise money for the city. They didn't have a police force. They didn't need one, but they created one in order to start ticketing people to raise money. And it worked as it relates to raising money. They raised millions, but with devastating effects on the poor people whose lives they were ruining purely not for the sake of public safety, but for the sake of fundraising. So how do we get to this point? How did America allow its criminal justice system to be hijacked? Well, one of the easiest ways to understand that is a simple $3 fee that used to exist in every municipal, county, felony, misdemeanor case in Missouri. It was called the Sheriff's Retirement Fund. So back in the 1980s, the rural sheriffs in Missouri came to the legislature and they said, you know what? Our guys aren't making enough money in retirement. The state retirement system is based on what they're making, and we're not paying them anything because we have low tax bases in rural Missouri. And so we need some more money for our sheriff retirement. If you know anything about politics in Missouri, you know that the sheriff is, generally speaking, the most powerful local politician in a rural part of the state. And the state lawmakers are not going to argue with the sheriff. But nearly every Republican state lawmaker in Missouri for the past decade or so has signed off on Grover Norquist's No New Taxes pledge. In fact, most Republicans in most state legislatures throughout the country have signed off on that pledge or some form of a No New Taxes pledge. And so they put themselves in a bind. I got to help the sheriff, but I'm not going to raise taxes, and there's not enough money in the state budget to take money from schools or healthcare or roads or crime. So what am I going to do to help the sheriff? Here's an idea. Let's put a $3 fee on all of the criminal cases in Missouri, no matter what size they are, no matter whether it affects that local sheriff or not. Over time, lawmakers in Missouri and other states who do the same thing have found that charging fines and fees in the criminal justice system is a tremendous way to raise money as a backdoor tax. Conservative lawmakers can say to their constituents, I did not raise your taxes, and still say to the sheriffs or the prosecutors or the county clerks or the brain injury trust fund or the domestic violence fund or whatever group comes to them asking for money that they found a way to get them their money. And that's why since the last Great Recession in 2008, until the time my book published in 2022, North Carolina fines and fees rose 400%. And that's symbolic of what's happened in almost every state in the country. So this $3 fee gets added and everybody's paying it. Well, in a state like Missouri, who's really paying it? People in St. Louis and people in Kansas City. Because that's where the majority of the tickets are by number, just in terms of population. So people in Kansas City and Missouri started paying for rural sheriffs to get a supplement to their retirement. Eventually, a local judge, a gentleman named Frank Vatterott, realized this is wrong. This is unconstitutional. There's a theory in the criminal justice system that goes all the way back to the Magna Carta from England, which is part of the basic of how American law was built. And it's called no sale of justice. The idea in the Magna Carta was that the king was requiring people to have to basically pay to have access to the judicial system. And they ultimately said, no, we can't do that. You can't keep people away from the judicial system because they don't have money. And that concept exists in American law and in pretty much every state constitution. And Vatterott realized that this $3 fee and the other fees like it were a violation of the concept of no sale of justice. Because if you make it so that poor people can't afford to participate in the system, whether they're being charged for the crime or whether they're being forced to pay a bunch of fees if they want to file a civil lawsuit, then you've created a dichotomous system that isn't fair. One for people with money and one for people without. So Vatterott filed a lawsuit against the Sheriff's Retirement Fund. It failed. He filed another one. It failed. He eventually found two lawyers in Kansas City who realized that to have standing to file the lawsuit, you had to have clients who had paid the $3 fee. So they filed the lawsuit in Kansas City a few years ago on behalf of their clients who had pleaded guilty to a driving offense and had paid the $3 fee. And it's made its way to the US or to the Missouri Supreme Court, and they won. They won unanimously. The court said, you can't charge that $3 fee. It has nothing to do with the dispensation of justice in most jurisdictions in this state. So now there's another lawsuit, also filed by a couple of different lawyers in Kansas City, that's making its way through the system that hopefully will go to trial this fall, that is challenging almost every statutory fee that exists in the Missouri judicial system. And I think they're going to win. And that is going to be a massive step towards a more just system where poor people that get a speeding ticket don't have to pay $300 or $400 because the legislature used the criminal justice system as a backdoor tax, because that's basically what they've been. The reality of this backdoor taxing system is that it has devastating effects on people's lives. My book talks about 3 different women. One from Oklahoma, a woman named Kendi Kilman, Brooke Bergen from Missouri, and a woman named Sasha Darby in Columbia, South Carolina. They're all poor. They're all single moms. They all got charged with relatively minor offenses and ended up having devastating effects on their lives, primarily because they were poor, because the criminal justice system was trying to use itself to collect money. Sasha Darby's case is tragic. She's an African-American woman who lived in Columbia, South Carolina. She had a job. She had a kid. She had a place to live. She and her roommate got a little bit of tiff over rent. Got in an argument. Sasha thought her roommate was going to punch her. So she reached out and slapped her roommate. Committed an assault. Roommate calls the cops. Sasha knows she's in trouble. She goes out and she sits in front of her apartment, waits for the police to get there. And the police get there and they said, are you Sasha? Yep, I'm Sasha. Can you tell me what happened? My roommate and I were having an argument. I thought she was going to hit me, so I slapped her. I realized shouldn't do that, stopped. She called you, and that's why we're here. Went and talked to the roommate. Roommate told the same story. Wrote Sasha Darby a ticket for misdemeanor assault that had a summons and a certain day to appear before the judge. So she goes to appear before the judge in Columbia, South Carolina. And she makes a mistake that a lot of people make when they first enter the courtroom. That particular courtroom has this sheet of paper on a table as you're walking in that hopefully you see. And it lists some of your rights. One of your rights is the Sixth Amendment right to an attorney. Asks you if you can afford an attorney. And if you can't, do you need the public defender? And if you need the public defender, do you have $40 for the public defender? Now, what most people don't realize when they see that is the judge has the right to waive that $40 charge for the public defender. And most public defender systems throughout the country will waive that $40. The last thing you should do is waive your right to an attorney. And what did Sasha do? Same thing Kendi Kilman did in Oklahoma, waive their right to an attorney. Went before the judge. Judge asked her what happened. She told her what happened. She was honest with the judge. The judge says, wow, you shouldn't have told me that. Which, by the way, if she had an attorney, she wouldn't have. But all she did was tell the judge the truth. And the judge said, well, you just admitted to misdemeanor assault. So I'm finding you guilty of misdemeanor assault. And you owe $1,100 in fees. Can you pay that today? No, I can't. Okay, well, go to the clerk and work out a payment arrangement. So Sasha goes and works out a payment arrangement. And she tries to pay. She makes a couple of payments. She misses a month. Well, what happens in the criminal justice system when you owe them money and you don't pay? You get a warrant out for your arrest. So Sasha Darby, a couple of months later, is at her family's house. They've got a relative who's having some mental health issues that they're trying to get some health care for, to get taken care of with the hospital. but they know that it's going to be complicated, and they ask the police to be there that day so that there's no issues. So the police are there, Sasha's there, they're all trying to talk about how they're going to get their relative into the hospital. And the police officer who's there happens to be the one who arrested Sasha for misdemeanor assault. Decides to run her name through the system. Lo and behold, there is a warrant for Sasha Darby's arrest. So she gets arrested and taken to the court right away to appear before the same judge. She still owes $700. She hasn't committed another assault. She hasn't so much as spit on the sidewalk. But she owes the court $700. And the judge says, can you pay? And she says, no. And the judge says, well, here's what we do in this jurisdiction. If you can't pay, I'm sending you to jail. And I'll take off $50 a day every day you're in jail. And by the time your fees are paid, then you can go. Sasha's 8 months pregnant, goes to the jail in Columbia, South Carolina, gets out after about 21 days, no longer has a place to live, calls a friend, goes to sleep on her friend's couch. That night feels some pain, goes up into the bathtub, miscarries her baby the night she got out of jail. I believe the criminal justice system killed her child. That's how devastating the consequences can be for poor people who get caught up in this system and they can't escape it. It's not just you end up with bad credit. It's you end up in jail. You end up with increased charges because you end up in jail over and over again. You end up with devastating personal consequences because the system exists to take your money, not to keep the rest of us safe. Putting Sasha Darby in jail for 21 days didn't keep us safe, didn't do anything to improve public safety. It just allowed a judge an opportunity to be able to check a box that says she collected $700 on behalf of the taxpayers of Columbia, South Carolina. The good news is that there is a movement to fix this problem. I talked about at the beginning, there is now a national movement called End Justice Fees. And it's sponsored by Americans for Prosperity on the right, American Civil Rights or ACLU on the left, Fines and Fees Justice Center in the middle, and some other nonprofits and university professors that are trying to build a national campaign to get legislatures to take away all of their different $3 fees and judges to stop putting people in jail because they're poor. In 2019, the Missouri Supreme Court ruled in 2 cases involving people that had cases very similar to Brooke Bergen and Corey Booth and Amy Moore. Their names were George Ritchie and John Wright. And the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that it is illegal in the state of Missouri to put somebody in jail because they can't afford to pay a board bill, the bill that you get if you're in jail in most counties in Missouri. At the same time, the state legislature passed a bill sponsored by former state rep Bruce DeGroote, a Republican from Chesterfield, that basically mimicked the Supreme Court decision and put in state statute that there is no criminal liability for being unable to pay a board bill. They're still charging board bills. They didn't get rid of them, which is what I would have loved to see. But that was progress. In Idaho, about a year after that, the Supreme Court there also ruled unanimously in a very similar case involving a woman named Roxana Beck that it is illegal in the state of Idaho to put a poor person in jail because they can't afford to pay their fines and fees. So there is progress on this front in terms of legislatures, both in red states and blue states, recognizing that the idea of criminalizing the poor in the name of justice is a really bad idea. One of the areas in which there's most incremental progress, and it frustrates the heck out of me that this hasn't happened in Missouri yet, Just today in Alabama, a state Senate committee advanced a bill that would get rid of Alabama's law that automatically suspends driver's licenses for failure to pay court debt. When I started writing my book, more than half the states in the country had a law like that. Missouri still does. So you're poor, you get your bill from the court system for your misdemeanor theft or your misdemeanor assault or your driving offense, and you get behind and you can't pay your bill. On top of the possibility of having a warrant out for your arrest, the Department of Revenue, in about half the states now in the country, can automatically suspend your driver's license if the court system sends them a note that, hey, this person hasn't paid their fines and fees. No hearing, no ability to pay hearing, no judicial determination that you were trying to pay but couldn't afford to, just your driver's license is suspended. Think about the consequences of that decision. You're a poor person who needs your car to drive to get to your job so that you can make money to pay your court fees. And the state says, no, we're taking your driver's license away. Well, how are you supposed to get to your job to pay them the money that you owe them? You know what poor people do when their driver's license is suspended? And I can speak from personal experience. They still drive their cars because they have families to take care of. And unless they live somewhere that has magical, wonderful transit, they're going to drive their cars. That's what happened to Brooke Bergen. During much of the time I was writing this book, Brooke was in state prison. She was in state prison for driving on a suspended license. Because that's what happens when they take your license because you can't pay court fees, and you decide that you have to drive in order to live, then you get a ticket for driving on a suspended license. That's a criminal charge. And if you've had more than one, the penalties keep increasing. So somebody like Brooke, who is now well known within the system, she gets driving on a suspended license, she goes to state prison. She was there for 9 months, and we would talk on the phone and we would email, and she tried to keep her spirits up about getting home to see her kids. She had 2 kids. And a couple of weeks before she gets out of prison, I'm talking to her about the book and when the book's going to come out, and she's all excited about that. And I promised to come down and see her in Dent County. And I look on Facebook, and she gets out of jail, and there's a nice picture of her with her kids. And I send her a Facebook message, hey, good to see you. How about maybe next week I come down? And she says, great. And 2 days later, I get a Facebook message from some person whose name I don't recognize. It's a friend of Brooke. Brooke died of a drug overdose the day before. Never got to go down and see her again. Again, this is a reality of the criminal justice system when it's dealing with poor people. Look, Brooke Bergen made her mistakes, right? She was a flawed human being like we all are. But the system made it next to impossible for her, for no discernible positive element, no discernible positive purpose, made it impossible for her to battle her own demons. Her funeral service was held at a funeral parlor across the highway from the Walmart where she stole the $8 tube of mascara. I'm standing outside as they're bringing the casket out, and it's the first time I really noticed. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's the Walmart. This is what killed her, that interaction with the criminal justice system right there, because it never gave her the opportunity to battle her demons. It doesn't have to be this way. Brooke Bergen, Kendi Kilman, Sasha Darby, they have under our constitutional system the exact same civil rights that we have, that everybody in this room has. And I ask people at the end of my book a simple question. Do you believe your civil rights are worth more than theirs? I hope you agree with me that they aren't, and that our criminal justice system has to be reformed so that it is much more focused on public safety and less on serving as a backdoor tax collector for lazy legislatures who won't do their job. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. I appreciate you all being here. Let's have a Q&A. Let's answer some questions. Howard.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Tony. Just to point out, I would have been in the AFB crowd. I was probably been, but how widespread across different states? I mean, the states you mentioned are very like red states, but I would imagine even in California or Washington State in the rural areas, this is just probably what goes on also.
It's everywhere. It's everywhere. So I write in the book a little bit about California. One of the judges that I quote is a woman named Lisa Foster. She's now the co-director, co-founder of Fines and Fees Justice Center, used to be a judge in California. And part of the problem with California is the fines and fees are so high there that it's completely out of whack. And then in California, you have the same problem we have in North St. Louis County, where the people that experience the brunt of this are people of color, either Latinos or Blacks for the most part. Minnesota is another state that I write about in the book a little bit because they've had some interesting court challenges to fines and fees, and specifically the payment of the board fees. It's in every single state. It was estimated a few years ago by the Brennan Center for Justice that there is about $50 billion in unpaid fines and fees that exists in the American court system right now. And the system is spending a lot of money trying to collect that money, but it isn't very good at it because it's a really inefficient tax. In New Mexico, they did a study a couple of years ago studying how much government bodies spend trying to collect fines and fees through the court system. And what they found is when you figure in all the costs, the time for sheriff's deputies and to go hand out these warrants and pick people up and put them in jail and then hire collection firms to try to collect the money, they're spending more money than they're bringing in trying to collect this money. And that is one reason why groups like Americans for Prosperity, who tend to focus on efficient tax policy and that sort of thing, realize, hey, you know what? This isn't conservative government. It doesn't make sense to spend money that we don't have to collect money from people who don't have it. It is a very inefficient use of government's fund spending and very bad tax policy. Yes. Why does it happen? This is a question that I ask myself all the time. Part of the why is simply because the legislature turned to the courts to raise money, and the courts just figured, well, that's the way it's always been. That's the way it's going to be. Part of the reason it happens this way, one of the things I talk about in the book, there's a chapter in the book called Judges versus Judges. So in Missouri, in all of the rural counties, and in all of the counties in Missouri except for St. Louis City, St. Louis County, the major counties that make up Kansas City, and recently Springfield, Greene County. All of the judges, the other circuit court judges, are elected in partisan elections. They run as Republicans or Democrats against other Republicans or Democrats, just like the county commission or the sheriff or whatever. The members of the appellate court and the Supreme Court in Missouri end up in their positions through what used to be called the Missouri Plan. Some people call it the nonpartisan court plan, but it is basically a system that at least adds some merit to the equation. Where a commission, you have to apply to become a judge to be on the appellate court or on the Supreme Court. A commission determines your qualifications, advances 3 finalists, and then the governor makes an appointment. And over time, those commissions are generally pretty balanced between Democrats and Republicans, and the types of judges that you get in the appellate court and the Supreme Court are of a little bit higher quality with a little bit less political pressure on them. And that's really the biggest key, is the political pressure. Because here's the thing, all of the judges that are judges here in St. Charles County or in St. Louis County or in St. Louis or on the Supreme Court now went to the same law schools for the most part. Most of them went to the University of Missouri or SLU or Wash U if you're judges here in Missouri. I was talking to a law school class in Tulsa the other day, and in Oklahoma, the judges there all go to most of the Oklahoma schools. You'll always end up with a few that are sort of Ivy League judges that come back here, but usually in Missouri we send the Ivy League judges to the Senate, where they can do less harm. But so the judges all went to the same place, right? They studied the same laws. They got the same degrees. Yet when Matthew Mueller, the public defender who was fighting the system and filing all of these cases saying, stop putting my clients in jail because they're poor, every single circuit court judge, because it wasn't just Ritchie and Wright's case, he filed like 20 or 30 of these cases in jurisdictions all across the state to try to get one to the Supreme Court. All the circuit judges said no. You're telling me I did my job wrong, I'm telling you no. Every single one of them. And then yet when it gets to the Supreme Court says unanimously and very clearly, with no unambiguity, circuit court judges are wrong. You can't put people in jail because they're poor. This is illegal. So I think part of it is the pressure in terms of the different types of judges. Idaho, same situation. Circuit court judges there in that very red state were putting people in jail because they were poor, and the Supreme Court there said no. And it wasn't even a close case. Part of it's just the simple political pressure. If you're a circuit court judge who's elected and you're running for an election at the same time as the sheriff and the same time as the prosecutor, and everybody's running on the same tough on crime, sort of platform, it's hard in a small county to be the one who stands out and says, I'm going to upend the system. It's why these movements to get the legislatures to make the changes are so important. If the legislatures take the fines and the fees away, at least the ones that have nothing to do with the dispensation of justice, then the judges can do less harm. Yes.
So I would assume that the fines and fees, when they're part of the sentence structure, they're discretionary in almost every state. But are those, like the sheriff's retirement one, are those mandated to be tacked onto her, or was there judicial discretion there where they could say, I'm not going to charge you this, $3 thing?
So there's an argument to be made that there's always judicial discretion, that a judge can, if a judge has a proper hearing on whether or not somebody's indigent and whether or not somebody has an inability to pay, that the judge has not only the opportunity, but the duty to wipe all of those away. That doesn't happen very often. It does happen occasionally. It happened in Kendi Kilman's case, eventually after some attorneys took up for her and got the judge to wipe out the fees in her case. She's now a plaintiff in a class action lawsuit in Oklahoma to try to upend their system. They just got a good ruling yesterday, actually, that overturned the district court judge who tried to kick the case out. And the appeals court said, no, this is really unconstitutional. You need to have a trial. And so it's good to see that that's going. I believe I gave a talk a couple of months ago to some judges in Georgia, and some of them agreed with me and some of them very much did not. I believe the judges have discretion, generally speaking, if they do their job. And this is part of the problem. Most poor people aren't getting indigency hearings, and they aren't getting ability to pay hearings in these minor cases because they're cattle calls. It's 50 people that are there to pay a ticket, and the judge is just running through and doesn't want to clog up his docket by saying, well, are you a poor person? Do you have an attorney? Do I need to set another date so that you can get an attorney, or we can get a public defender for you and determine whether or not you're a poor person and can afford to pay the fees? A lot of people in the sort of the movement to get rid of fines and fees make a clear delineation between fines, which are supposed to have a judicial purpose. So if there is a statutory fine that says if you speed over 20 miles an hour, you owe $50, there is an argument to be made that fine needs to be paid by everybody because that is supposed to stop people from wanting to speed. There's a difference between that and all of the fees, which are mostly non-judicial extraneous things that legislatures have put on the courts to raise money for other purposes. Tom.
I would disagree with your initial surmise is that the system was hijacked. I'm not aware in Western jurisprudence from 1215 to today that the system hasn't been corruptly in favor of the rich and oppressive to the poor. So I don't think it's been hijacked. It's been changed a bit here and there, but certainly not hijacked. There has never been any ideal system that served people, whatever the Magna Carta might have said, it never came about. But I think you put your finger on it earlier when you were talking about the fact that all these judges went to the same law school. They all went to a law school where all the curricula are the same and where they haven't changed since the days that law schools grabbed a hold of the monopoly on who gets to be a judge or who gets to be a lawyer during the Great Progressive era. Okay. Have you ever considered investigating, for example, the possibility that taking away the monopoly that law schools have on who gets to practice law, who gets to be a judge? That's one issue. Another issue, of course, is that we either have in our society, it's either a civil offense, a tort, car accident, breach of contract, something along those lines, or it's a crime. What about the middle area? Because the lady who was poor stole the mascara, take the burden of those costs over her, she's still poor.
I want to tell a quick story about that because I recently wrote a column about somebody who's in that sort of middle area. A woman named Lori Ann Stumeyer. She lives in Pilot Knob in Iron County. And she was at the local park in Ironton with her dog. She's got a dog who's a pit bull. And it was a quiet day. It was a nice day. She let her dog off the leash so the dog could play in the water. She's never had a problem with the dog. There's no record of the dog having any issues. And apparently there ended up being some interaction with a kid where a kid got scratched, told his mom he got bit, whatever. She says she saw the kid and saw a scratch, didn't see anything, but she took her dog, put back on the leash and went home. She ended up getting a summons later that day for having a loose animal in the park, misdemeanor. Not even a misdemeanor, an ordinance violation in the city of Ironton. So she goes to court and the judge finds her guilty and orders her to pay $2,700 in what he called restitution. Some of it was fines and fees, and some of it was money that he said was going to go to the mother of the child and the child for medical bills, although there's nothing in the court record that shows an existence of those bills or evidence or anything. So she gets sentenced to 3 days in jail, but the sentence is suspended. That's something judges do a lot. They say, I'm being tough, you get 3 days in jail, but I'm showing mercy. You don't have to go to jail unless you violate your probation. Well, what happened to Lori Ann Stumeyer? She lives on $892 in federal disability income. She missed a payment. Judge sent her to jail for 3 days. Had a loose dog. That's a case where another lawyer locally happened to see what was going on and wrote a letter to the judge and said, hey, if there's restitution, that's a civil matter. And you just used her inability to get involved in some sort of civil matter by punishing her criminally by putting her in jail. Don't do that again or I'll be forced to get involved. And then I wrote about it. And now the case is just in this weird limbo where the judge hasn't responded and hasn't done anything. And so we'll see what happens. But that's an interesting point, Tom, because there are cases like that sort of cross between Kansas. The state of Kansas has had a problem with this, where people get behind in their medical bills. And that's a civil problem. And the hospitals go to the court and ask the court to impose a civil penalty so that they can collect their money. And yet, in some of those cases, when the judge does that, even though it's completely a civil matter, they end up in jail because they miss a court date or because they don't make a payment. And so there is a confusion, but the between the civil and the criminal, but the commonality is the court's being used to collect money for somebody, whether it's civil or otherwise. I'm going to get to some other questions. We got any more? Somebody else?
So sounds like you talked to a wide variety of groups. That's why you actually said you spoke to the judges.
Yeah.
So who gives you pushback and says, no, it's actually a good system? Other than, is it just people who are benefiting from it, or do people, you go and you explain it and then they say, well, no, it's actually fine?
Some of the judges. So when I went to Georgia, I was invited there to speak to their association of municipal judges last summer. And I asked the director of the association, I said, what's my audience? And she said, well, you're going to have about a third of the judges who are relatively new and practice in Atlanta and the suburbs and recognize that we have a problem in our judicial system because they don't really like being used as tax collectors. You're going to have a group of judges in the middle who haven't historically done a lot of municipal law and don't recognize what the problem is. And so they're going to be sort of sponges. And then you're going to have mostly older, white, Southern judges who are not going to like the fact that you're talking about Black and brown people a lot. And indeed, that was my audience. And there was a really good mix of, one of my first questions from the judges in Georgia was, why are you trying to make this about race? Well, statistically, in a lot of cities, it is about race. It just is. And that was the reality in North St. Louis County. It was the reality in Minneapolis. It's the reality in California. It's the reality in some parts of Colorado. It just is. When you statistically study who are the people who are suffering the most under these fines and fees systems in area that have large minority populations, it's people of color who are suffering more. And so that's part of the story, and that has to be part of the story. The interesting part about that, I write about this in the book. I confess on myself. I did something when I was writing the series of columns in the Post-Dispatch in 2018 and 2019 that I'm not really proud of, but I did it on purpose as a strategy. I was writing mostly about poor rural white people. And I came across a few really fascinating cases of Black people. One of them was a woman named Precious Jones who got a speeding ticket in Lafayette County over on the Kansas City side of I-70. And I didn't write about her case or Clifton Harris, another Black man whose case I came across. I sat on the cases involving people of color for a period of time until I knew white rural lawmakers in Missouri realized they had a problem and saw themselves and their relatives and their constituents in this story and decided to get involved. And then I wrote some of the columns about people of color who were suffering in the same way that we already knew the story was.
Noticed that when you're writing these columns.
I did that on purpose. I apologized to some of the people that I had talked to and interviewed for columns and said, I'm sorry I haven't gotten to this one yet, but I wanted to make a difference. And I wanted the legislature to see people that they cared about enough to do something. And it worked. So
Like I said, when is Messenger going to get around to the race?
Yes.
So when you were talking about the case with the restitution and you said there was confusion, I mean, it sounded like a confused judge because I didn't think you could do direct restitution in Missouri unless it's civil.
You can't, and there's nothing,
Yeah.
and specifically, there's nothing in the ordinance
Fine.
that even discusses restitution, and even worse, the charge that she was charged with was just having a loose animal. She wasn't even charged or convicted of having an animal that bit somebody that might lead to restitution. She just had a loose dog. There's no victim. And so that was a case of small town judge deciding to do, this is one of those stories where I don't think I know the full backstory. I tried to figure out if there was a connection between the judge and the victim he was trying to get money to. And maybe that there is somewhere. Some of you who have read about Iron County recently know that it's a county that has a lot of weird things going on in its politics. So, but that was a judge who just literally didn't follow the law. And this woman's had consequences because she spent 3 days in jail.
Well, it got me thinking about when I worked for the Department of Corrections years ago, and they had victims comp fund, which I believe was non-discretionary. So anybody who had a crime against a person had that fee. It was like $15 per crime or something. Slapped onto their sentence, and they garnished their prison wages. And I assume they garnished wages or collected the fees if they were on probation. But is that going to be affected? You said there that the ruling is going to result in the law for the sheriff's retirement fund.
Right, the sheriff's retirement fee has already been ruled
Yeah, it's a victim comp fund. Is that
it might be. So there are 15 to 20 different fees that are involved in this particular lawsuit, and many of them are just like the sheriff's fee. They're for extrajudicial officers, so county clerk's retirement, prosecutor's retirement, assistant prosecutors, deputy sheriffs, a bunch of things like that. But there are groups of fees within the system that I can imagine the judge may say, no, that one's related to the dispensation of local justice. Yeah. And so I don't know if the victims compensation fund is in there. I got to go back and check. I haven't looked at the court files in a while, but one of the ones that's there that is interesting to me, because around the time I started writing these columns, somebody pitched me a column about the brain injury fund. There's a brain injury fund. There's a nonprofit that's based in St. Louis that does really good, important work helping people who have brain injuries and end up having, lifelong effects. I mean, people who fall off their bike and hit their head and then end up needing help getting to and from the grocery store and stuff like that. And there's lots of folks who have this, and there's this nonprofit called the Brain Injury. I don't remember if it's called the Brain Injury Fund, but they are funded in part through a fee that we all pay in traffic tickets and criminal cases in Missouri. And who wouldn't want to raise money for the brain injury fund, right? Well, I think it was late 2018, maybe mid 2018, I met with them, and they're like, I met with one of their clients, and I was working on a column about the brain injury fund. And I get halfway through it, and I realize that what they're actually doing is they're lobbying the legislature to increase their fee that goes on court cases. And from the time I started working on the column till the time I almost wrote it, I had become educated on what a bad idea this was, that's the wrong way to raise money for even a wonderful nonprofit. And I ended up apologizing to them. I said, I can't write this column because I'm not going to try to help you raise money through a backdoor tax through the court system. And I'm just going to drop it. But that's one of the fees that is in this lawsuit that's making its way through the courts in Missouri that hopefully will go to trial. I'll check. I don't remember. I'll email you. I'll check. The victim service fund might be in there, and that's where it's really going to be controversial if they win. And I think they'll win. But what happened when the sheriffs lost? They came right back to the legislature the next year, last year, and asked to put a $50 fee on services on process servers that are doing eviction cases. Now, It's not a court fine and fee in the same way. They probably can make an argument that they can get away with it constitutionally, but it's the same thing, because what do process servers do in eviction cases? They pass those court costs on to the people that they're evicting. And so some poor person is going to pay that backdoor tax one way or another. Yes.
Say that it like it's passed in the state. What happens to people who are like currently making payments on?
That'll be part of the question. So they're trying to make it a class action lawsuit so that people who are part of the class, people who have paid those fees, might get some money back. That's a second part of the question. So the judge is going to have to decide, is it constitutional, and is it a class action, and who's going to pay? And so there's a bunch of big questions related to it. The most important thing for me is to get the Missouri courts to recognize this is unconstitutional. Missouri would be the first state, if that happens, that would really go seriously in that regard. The easier way to do it would be for the legislature to do it. There's a bill in New York's legislature that tries to basically do that, basically erase all fees dealing with the court system other than fines for speeding, fines for, committing an offense, that sort of thing. It hasn't made any way through because it's hard for the legislature to get their minds around that, because once you have one senator who doesn't want to get rid of the Victim Service Fund, one senator who used to be a sheriff, one senator who has a relative who had a brain injury, then all of a sudden you can't get that stuff done. So the courts might have to be the ones to do it. But if that does happen, it'll be a massive legislative fight, because lots of folks who are getting money put into their system right now won't have it. That $3 sheriff's fee in a single year would raise anywhere between $3 and $5 million a year for that retirement fee. So we're talking about a lot of money if the fines and fees in Missouri go away, which is a good thing, but will create an incredible legislative difficulty.
Okay, so we're at time. Thank you for coming, and
Thank you all very much.